Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 12a, where we're going to say some concluding words about the way the Gospels themselves conclude, and that is with Jesus' resurrection from the dead. As you'll see here, I've quoted from 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul emphasizes just how central he thinks resurrection is to what it means to be a believer in Christ. So he says to certain Corinthians who don't believe in the resurrection, and that's important. He says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain, it's futile, you're still in your sins. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people the most to be pitied. In other words, no resurrection, faith is meaningless, the whole thing's a sham. That's Paul's outlook. Although we want to already note that this letter, written in the 50s of the first century, well before the Gospels are written, is already responding to members of the Corinthian Christian community, the church in Corinth, who, for whatever reason, deny the resurrection, or at least conceive of it so differently that Paul frames it as a denial. We won't be able to cover every aspect of questions about resurrection, or even the Gospel's depictions of resurrection, but I think there are some widespread misunderstandings and some elements of the narrative depiction of Jesus' resurrection that aren't well understood. And it's to these I want to turn. First of all, we'll just pick up a bit more with what Paul has to say, because in a sense, Paul is our earliest witness to Jesus' resurrection. This is the earliest written record we have of someone commenting on what it means that Jesus was resurrected. And in a sense, what we're going to do is pick at what did they think that meant? Because one thing I want you to take away is that the category resurrection is a stranger category than you might initially suspect. So to quote from a bit earlier in 1 Corinthians, we have here Paul saying that he passed on to people he evangelized to something he himself was first told. And it's interesting here to note that Paul uses the technical terminology that we find later in early rabbinic Judaism of receiving and transmitting tradition. And so that means you get taught and things are sort of marked off as specially authoritative tradition. He says, I was taught this and I passed it on. The reason I say that is that that means here we get a glimpse not only into the state of affairs in the 50s, but really into a state of affairs somewhat earlier, as early as Paul's conversion, or whatever you want to call Paul, the revelation Paul had of Christ, to the time he was first instructed. This is what some believers in Jesus were saying. What were they saying? That Jesus died, that he was buried. That's important. It at least gestures toward physical, corporeal burial. That he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. That's an interesting detail. Already the notion of telling the story of Jesus' resurrection in harmony with, or as made sense of by prophecies from the Old Testament, was already a feature of early Christian storytelling. And here what I really want to focus on, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, some have died. Then he appeared to James, the brother of the Lord, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. If you read that statement, and you think about the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, and Paul's experience of seeing the risen Lord in the book of Acts, is there anything that strikes you as slightly discordant? Well, some people could point out that Paul's experience is of a vision of an already risen and ascended Jesus. He just sees this bright light and says, "Who are you, Lord?" And in different versions, the vision of Jesus is told 3 times in the book of Acts. The details vary each time. The people with him just see a light, but don't hear the voice, or vice versa. What I think is interesting is that Paul talks about what happened to the apostles, the other apostles, and what happens to him as the same sort of thing. They're just appearances, they're visions. And that at least raises the question, Does Paul think that anyone saw the type of Jesus who could walk around, who could eat broiled fish, the sorts of things that happen in the Gospels? Or does Paul just think everybody saw spiritual type visions? Notice that when Paul is trying to tease out what exactly it is that rises, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, our body is sown as a soulish body. That's a very literal translation of the Greek, psychikos, pertaining to the soul, but it's raised as a spiritual body. Now that would strike some people as an oxymoron. Soma, body, is one thing, and spirit is another. But Paul thinks the resurrected body is a spiritual body. It's sort of both. And he wants to relate Jesus' resurrected body to contrasting Jesus to the first Adam. The first man, Adam, was a living psyche, a living soul, but the last Adam does one better. He's a life-giving pneuma, spirit. But notice there, Paul does not think pneuma is something opposite of body. It's a body consisting of spirit, or governed by the Spirit, or something else entirely. Paul here is not really our problem, but what we want to just note is that there was some uncertainty about what was a resurrection body supposed to be like. Was it just like a normal body? Was it fully physical but different in dimensions? Well, I'll just give a couple other early Christian speculations about that question. The Gospel of Peter, which probably post-dates the four Gospels we've looked at this semester, although some people claim it contains traditions that are earlier than the Synoptic Gospels. In any event, the Gospel of Peter tries to tease out this question, and it says what the resurrection looked like. Like it imagined there was a hidden security camera. And what would the hidden security camera at the tomb have seen? The soldiers there guarding, they saw two young men descend from heaven and enter the tomb. And then they saw three men coming out, with two supporting the other one, and a cross following them. How the cross got in the tomb, I'm not sure. And the head of the two reached to heaven, so they're sort of special angelic people. But the head of the one being led out by hand went beyond the heavens. All right, that's a very confusing depiction because they're men, they're physical, but two of them are gigantic and one of them is even more than gigantic. In a slightly more philosophical register, we get the very thoughtful Neoplatonist Christian Origen saying that Jesus existed in a sort of intermediate body. How does he mean intermediate? It was something between the grossness of that which he had before his passion. So it wasn't just a normal body of flesh and blood that gets tired and thirsty and so on, but it was also something different than the appearance of a soul uncovered by such a body. So it wasn't just a soul. It wasn't just a vision, in other words. To continue our discussion, let's remind ourselves of the basic data of the different Gospels. First of all, in Mark and in Matthew, they discover that Jesus is risen while they're in Jerusalem, and they're told he will appear in Galilee. Mark ends abruptly. In the Gospel of Matthew, the disciples go to Galilee, go to the prescribed mountain, and see him risen there. We'll come back to Matthew more later. We'll come to Luke now, because we have a rather different account. Importantly, no one ever goes to Galilee. They're told not to leave Jerusalem. They don't leave Jerusalem. All the appearances happen in Jerusalem. That's a historical problem for people who want to talk about where the resurrection appearances took place. We're not going to try to solve that problem here. Just note that there is a difference, a significant one. Luke 24, the women find the empty tomb. They see the angels. They tell the 11 who are gathered together, and they don't believe. The 11 say, "What are you talking about?" Then Peter finds clothes only in the tomb. So that's interesting. Then Luke interjects a unique story of two men en route to Emmaus, and these two men get a mysterious fellow traveling with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. That sure sounds like Eucharistic elements. Took, blessed, broke, gave. That's 4 verbs that Luke has used in his narrative of the Last Supper, 4 verbs in the exact same order. So this mysterious person almost performs a Eucharistic ceremony, and then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. I don't have time here to get into that, but there's something important there, connecting this mysterious figure performing something like a ritual that enables them to recognize the resurrected Christ. But this mysterious fellow journeyer then vanishes from their sight. These 2 guys from Emmaus then return. When they get back to Jerusalem, in the meantime, Jesus has appeared to Peter. So when they get back, Jesus is apparently appearing to people simultaneously in different places. Then Jesus appears in their midst and eats with them. And this is a common motif, apparently, to insist upon the physicality of Jesus' resurrection body. In other words, something like what Paul was already arguing with the Corinthians about back in the 40s and 50s, this sort of question has materialized in the narratives of the Gospels. So in this case, Jesus himself stood among them. They thought they were seeing a ghost. But this mistaken perception gets corrected. Why are you frightened? Why do doubts arise in your heart? Notice how often there's motifs of doubt in these accounts. Look at my hands and feet, see that it is I myself. In other words, why his hands and his feet? Because he still bears his wounds. When he said this, he showed him his hands and feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving, same note again, he said to them, "Do you have anything to eat?" He's been dead for 3 days, he's hungry. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, he took it and ate in their presence. What is this trying to prove? That he's not just a ghost, that it's not merely a vision like what Paul saw, it's a physical resurrection, someone you can touch and handle, as the Gospel of John will go even further in emphasizing. He gives final instructions, and he ascends into heaven. There ends the Gospel of Luke. If we come to the Gospel of John, John, as always, does things his own way. Mary Magdalene finds the stone rolled away from the tomb. Peter and the beloved disciple see that the tomb is empty after a bit of a foot race. Then Mary sees Jesus. Well, what's going to happen when she sees Jesus? Just like in Luke, there's a misperception. Mary turned around and saw Jesus, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Why is that? In Luke, they thought it was a ghost. In John, she thinks it's the gardener. Jesus says to her, "Mary," and she turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Just note here that John does things in his own idiom. So in the Gospel of John, Jesus says that he will call the sheep by their name. And when he calls them by name, they will hear him. And lo and behold, when he says Mary's name, this enables recognition. John also, in a way almost anticipating Origen, hundreds of years later, he suggests he has a peculiar sort of intermediate state. The resurrected Jesus is there. He's the sort of thing who could be touched, but he's the sort of thing who should not be touched. I have not yet ascended to the Father. So he is sort of physical, but he's not just physical. All right. Jesus then appears to his disciples. Thomas doesn't believe because he wasn't there to see it. Thomas wants to handle the wounds in Jesus' hands, the spear mark in his side. Finally, Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Galilee, and again, what happens? He stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus is like his old self, but he's also strangely difficult to recognize. And it takes something like him saying a disciple's name or something else for people to recognize who he is. Very briefly, how do you explain the resurrection? What if you wanted to go to sort of old-fashioned positivistic historical terms? This has been done, this continues to be done, although all the explanations are sort of strange, and many of them, in all honesty, seem dated in a postmodern age. So as early as Reimarus, we get the idea that the disciples really did steal the body. And the reason that the Gospel of Matthew has this rumor that the disciples might steal the body is that that was what happened, and Matthew's trying to cover it up. All right? Maybe Jesus wasn't quite dead. You notice in the Gospel of Mark that there's this note that he died awful quick. So maybe he got dumped in the tomb, sort of bloody and beaten, but not quite dead, and then he resuscitated and dragged himself out of the tomb and showed himself all beat up, and the disciples said, "Oh my gosh, he's alive from the dead." All right, that doesn't quite seem compelling either. It has been proposed that the disciples went to the wrong empty tomb. So Joseph of Arimathea reburied Jesus in a proper tomb. Hence, the disciples went to the wrong one and drew the wrong conclusion that he was alive from the dead. Gerhard Ludemann, in our own age, has also tried to propose sort of psychological explanations. Peter had a crisis from guilt for betraying Jesus, and therefore he saw a vision. And Paul had an unconscious fascination with the whole Jesus movement. And finally, this fascination just overwhelmed him, and I don't know, he saw a vision. I can't do justice to these because none of these is particularly even interesting, probably. So it's hard to give a sort of normal positivistic explanation of why people thought Jesus was alive from the dead. All right? There's nothing super compelling. And apologists for Christianity will point to this and say, aha, therefore it happened. But you're used to hearing me lecture by now. It's time to introduce the sed contra, the other side of that. We've also got to note that the idea of someone coming back from the dead or being alive from the dead or something like that is not particularly uncommon. So if it's cheating on the part of the Christian apologist who says, lo and behold, there's nothing like this in all of human history. Why would anyone believe he was alive from the dead unless he really was alive from the dead and appeared to his disciples? Well, not so fast. Just to cite a little sampler of the types of stories about people being either not in their tombs or something else, we note from the ancient world. From various sources, the bodies of Job's children couldn't be found because they weren't in their tombs. Ezra and Baruch were translated. John the Baptist's father has an empty tomb. John the Beloved has an empty tomb. Jesus' mother Mary ascended bodily from the grave. And in fact, in one telling of this story, the apostles came out of their own graves from around the world so they could stand on and cheer as Mary got taken into heaven. Simeon of Salos has an empty tomb. The bones of Heracles will go to pagan antiquity. The bones of Heracles are missing. Troas was raptured. Aeneas' body isn't to be found. Romulus disappeared. No one can say where Apollonius of Tyana was buried, and so on and so forth. Now, some of these are mythical figures, that is from the truly distant prehistoric past, so that's a wee bit different. But some of them are from the period of recorded history. All this is to say that Celsus has a point, this early Christian critic Celsus, when he says, why are we supposed to think all these other stories are legends, but your story is somehow noble and convincing? Celsus may be a pretty nasty critic of Christianity, but he's got a point there. This isn't the first time someone's come up with a story like this, okay? And if we even zoomed in on just one example, you can see how, I'm speaking as sort of a skeptic here, you can see how traditions start to arise. So to take one of the most elaborate stories, the founder of Rome, Romulus. Livy's story about Romulus, now again, Romulus is kind of a quasi-prehistoric figure, but still, the story bears interesting resemblance. Romulus descended from heaven at dawn and appeared to me, someone says. In awe and reverence I stood before him. And he said, go and tell the Romans that by heaven's will, Rome shall be capital of the world. And when he had spoken these words, he was taken up into the sky. Romulus is enveloped by a cloud and never seen again. And everyone is sort of devastated, bereft of their father. And some people start to proclaim Romulus's divinity. And some people hail him as a god and pray for him to protect them. Livy tells a great story here. He says some people were suspicious of this, but other people really felt comforted by realizing that it's okay. Romulus is in heaven now, and he's a protecting deity. And in fact, although it appeared that he was put to death, he's now prophesied Rome's greatness, and so on. You can kind of see some loose parallels that Christians are bereft of their Lord, Jesus. His early followers then arguably have a similar evolution. For whatever reasons, they come to think he is at God's right hand and has promised them well-being and that their movement will prosper, and that this hasn't merely been a travesty of justice, that God's providence has overseen all of this. Okay, enough of historical parallels. All I want to maybe suffice it to say is that be slow to accept either sort of the positivistic accounts which say, oh, it was just the wrong tomb or something. Most of these explanations are, frankly, on the silly side. There's no really good positivistic explanation. On the other side, there's lots of stories like this from the ancient world. And so you can't really draw the quick conclusion, well, because Christians told this story, theirs must be true. I want to change tacks here and note what I think is really an important thing. And that is, it's very strange that the Christians used the category resurrection. The reason this is strange is that everyone's supposed to be resurrected on the last day. And for those Jews who believed in a physical resurrection of the dead, folks are supposed to look like they used to look. I quote here from 2 Baruch, "The earth will give back its dead, not changing anything in their form." And the other important thing here, the earth will give back its dead at that time. In other words, there's two things about saying Jesus is resurrected that don't really make sense. One is that you would expect Christians to say, he will be resurrected because he was God's chosen one. Therefore, on the day when we are all resurrected, he will be too. And also, since the early Christian narratives all freely confess that Jesus didn't exactly look like he used to look, he was hard to recognize, there was something strange about him, it's very odd that they would describe that thing they saw as a resurrected Jesus and not just a vision of the vindicated Jesus. In other words, there's a lot of examples of post-mortem appearances of the dead. And in general, when that happens, people simply conclude that dead person's soul has been vindicated. They don't say that person has been resurrected from the dead. That makes no sense, because resurrection is something that happens in the future. In other words, to put it very well, from what is by far the single best book on the resurrection of Jesus, it was belief in the resurrection of Jesus, not knowledge of his crucifixion, that would have forced the disciples to reinterpret their expectations in drastic fashion. Far from being the straightforward product of dissonance, Easter faith must have been the cause of dissonance. That's a precious quotation. Dwell on it, please. What Allison is pointing out here is that it wasn't like the apostles were sitting around thinking, I wonder if the once-for-all future resurrection of the dead might happen piecemeal, one at a time, and Jesus might just have that future event happen in our lifetimes. That doesn't make any sense. Rather, however it happened, that Christians became convinced that the best way to describe their experience was with the category resurrection. That forced them to change their eschatology from a straightforward, normal Jewish eschatology, where at the end of time all people are raised, to a very kind of complicated and messy eschatology, where the beginning of the resurrection has already broken into finite human history. And therefore there's kind of this portal to the eschaton in the present, in the form of Jesus' resurrection. Again, to just state the obvious point, to take the story of, like, let's say the Maccabees. Before one of the big battles, I don't know if it's Judas or one of his brothers, sees a vision of the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, I can't remember, says something like, hey guys, the battle's going to go well. In that case, the Maccabees don't say, oh my gosh, Jeremiah is resurrected from the dead. He just says, yeah, Jeremiah is a prophet and he's with God and he can appear to me. The sort of simpler thing for Christians to have said about Jesus would have simply been to say, we've seen a vision of Jesus and that assures us that he really is the Christ and his soul is with God and he will come again in the end. Does that make sense? It's strange how Christians insist upon both continuity and discontinuity in the Jesus that they see. They see something like a physical creature who can walk with them, who can be mistaken for a person, and who can be recognized as Jesus, but who isn't immediately or easily recognized as Jesus. He's not just a normal person. He disappears. He appears in a different form. He moves through walls. But on the other hand, they recognize him as somehow containing the identity of that person they had known. And here we may have to reckon with the significant possibility of an empty tomb tradition. In other words, had they not thought the tomb was empty, knowing an empty tomb doesn't prove Jesus is raised, but had they not thought the tomb was empty, then when they had visions of someone who didn't look just like Jesus, it's hard to think why they would have thought it is Jesus, it's him resurrected. Apropos of the empty tomb tradition, we note that the witnesses are these women followers. In all four Gospels, for all their differences, they agree on this. And that's a strange sort of tradition, because women were not viewed in ancient Judaism as trustworthy witnesses. I quote from Josephus here. And in a sense, if you were going to just cook up a story and try to make your story compelling, you would have said the men saw it. So it's interesting that the early Gospels all agree, no, the people who saw the tomb was empty were first our women. We'll draw this breakneck survey of the resurrection to a conclusion by touching on later Christian theological reflections and what it is in the gospel accounts that they sort of draw on. The resurrection has a sort of strange status in the gospel accounts, in that it's not presented as the sort of thing that merely witnessing it removes all doubt. If you think about normal epistemic circumstances, that is, questions of what we know and don't know, believe and don't believe, normally to see something in front of you is to be fairly convinced of a state of affairs. Oddly enough, in the case of the resurrection, even those who see the risen Jesus are not always convinced. And it takes something like what the theologian Sarah Coakley calls an epistemic transformation to come to believe in the resurrection. And that's peculiar. To quote probably the most important 20th century theologian, Karl Barth, he says in what may strike you as cryptic fashion, he says the following about the resurrection. The resurrection is the true and original and typical act of revelation. Why? Because it is in principle not a historical fact. Barth says it cannot be historically verifiable so that faith remains God's sovereign act. There's a lot of theology under the surface here, peeking through like an iceberg. But what Barth is trying to get at, he says that the resurrection touches normal history like a tangent touches a circle. That is, it's not apart from the circle altogether, but it's also not a part of the circle. It just barely intersects. And partly here, he's got a whole theological scheme about how faith has to be a gift and something God imparts, and he's making hay from the resurrection accounts, but he's not all wrong about the resurrections, or rather the resurrection accounts as they're presented in the Synoptic Gospels. Just note again that even the witnesses of the resurrection who see him are still often unbelieving. Matthew 28:17. Even the disciples, when they go to the mountain Jesus prescribed, they saw him and worshipped him. And the next Greek phrase can be translated two ways. But some doubted, or but they all doubted. And again, we get these notes of disbelief. And what I think is important here is that even the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, which are fully persuaded of Jesus' resurrection, don't describe the resurrection in the same terms they describe seeing Jesus on a street in Galilee. They don't describe it as a straightforward state of affairs, such that to see it is to recognize it. They present it as something which it takes a little bit of extra activity on the part of God to enable those who witness it to understand what it means.